When an unclean spirit goes out of a man, he goes through dry places, seeking rest, and finds none. Then he says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when he comes, he finds it empty, swept, and put in order. Then he goes and takes with him 7 other spirits more wicked than himself, and they enter and dwell there. And the last state of that man is worse than the first. So shall it also be with this wicked generation. This may well be one of the more difficult teachings that Christ ever uttered. That being said, I have devoted a fair amount of time seeking understanding, and believe it accurately reflects the time we live in. First of all, there is much more here than a story about some individual with an unclean spirit. When we consider the context, we discover that he is not speaking of an individual, but a generation, denoting the spirit of an age. Here's the context of Matthew 12:43. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered, saying, Teacher, we want to see a sign from you. But he answered and said to them, An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. The men of Nineveh will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it. The queen of the south will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it. Following these passages, we arrive at what Jesus said about an unclean spirit, confirming our perspective by finishing with, the last of that man is worse than the first. So shall it also be with this wicked generation. The last of that man. What man is Jesus referring to? Might it be the first man, Adam, indicative of the old man or self, the natural/carnal man? Would it not be safe to say that an increase of lawlessness in any generation would accurately reflect an increase of the love of the self, collectively speaking? Most important to our consideration is that the Lord speaks of 7 other spirits more wicked than himself. Stephen Jones states that 7 is the biblical number of completion and spiritual perfection. 7 is best illustrated by the end or finish of the cycle of sowing and reaping, which then initiates the harvest. When we recognize that the divine principle of sowing and reaping is synonymous with resurrection, we get a better grasp of what is meant by the following. But this I confess to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. Sowing and reaping is not an event, but a process with a beginning and an end. As mentioned, the end of the cycle of sowing and reaping initiates the harvest. The end is a 7. And the harvest? This is the next step, which in essence is the 8th step. Here's what Stephen Jones wrote regarding its spiritual meaning. Chet is a fence in Hebrew. It can also signify an inner room, even the heart itself. 8 is the number of new beginning. The sons of Abraham were to be circumcised on the 8th day, because the 8th day was the lawful time for the presentation of the firstborn. It took a full 7 days to consecrate the priests, and then they emerged from the tabernacle on the 8th day. God then manifested his presence to the people on the 8th day. In the New Testament, Jesus was raised from the dead on the 8th day to fulfill the law of the wave sheaf offering. Likewise, Pentecost occurred 7 weeks later on the 50th day, which was also the 8th day. As we showed earlier, Jesus prophesied on the 8th day of Tabernacles about the outpouring of the Spirit. These examples all fulfill the law of the presentation of the firstborn on the 8th day in Exodus 22, 29, and 30. 7 is fruit, 8 is harvest. But the amazing thing about 8 is that it is a manifestation of the exponential factor. That is the principle of one to many. What begins with just one seed leads to a tree with much more fruit and seed than what started the process. Resurrection works in the same way. Like sowing and reaping, resurrection is a process, not an event. Paul said, "There will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust." Why is this? Because the same seed or word of God is responsible for both. The same law in its spiritual essence provokes obedience or disobedience. Now, here's the kicker. Before the Lord raised Lazarus from the dead, he told his sister Martha, "I am, not will be, the resurrection." He then demonstrated this fact by raising Lazarus from the dead. But how can this be? The resurrection had not yet come, had it? Yes, it had, in the person of Jesus Christ. Friend, God did not wave a magic wand and make Jesus the Christ or anointed by happenstance. Rather, Jesus went through the same process of sowing and reaping that you and I go through to reach the end of the process, which is to bear the divine fruit of the Spirit. When Jesus came to John the Baptist to be baptized, this is why he stated, "Let it be so now, for thus it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness." Once Jesus was baptized, we're told that the heavens were open to him. This is resurrection. In confirmation, here's what Jesus told Nicodemus. "No one has ascended into heaven except he who descended from heaven, the Son of Man." Ascended into heaven? Does this not align with the heavens being open to him? It does. Furthermore, this ascension started a new beginning for the people of Israel, as well as the world. So let me say it again. Resurrection is not an event, but a process. So, anytime we consider it, we must remind ourselves that we are talking about a divine process that is currently working in our midst. Now, let's bring all of this back to the following. Then he goes and takes with him 7 other spirits more wicked than himself, and they enter and dwell there. And the last of that man is worse than the first. So shall it also be with this wicked generation. Correct me if I'm wrong, but when we add 7 other spirits to himself, don't we now have an 8th? We do. And would this suggest a resurrection of the unjust? It would. Resurrection is not an event, but a process. At this point, I will close, but in the next study, we will look more into this subject. Thank you for being a part of this YouTube channel.